Picture this, the Vatican, year 1501. The holiest palace in Christendom, where marble corridors echo with prayers, incense drifts toward heaven, and saints seem to watch from painted walls. Yet on one infamous night, these same halls would witness something so scandalous, so unholy, that history itself recoiled in shame. Imagine the glow of hundreds of candles, their flames flickering against frescoes of Christ and the Apostles. Instead of solemn hymns, laughter and whispers fill the air. Instead of monks in quiet prayer, cardinals, nobles, and courtesans gather for a night that would become legendary, not for piety, but for sin. At the center of it all sits Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose name would forever be tied to corruption, desire, and ambition. They called it the Banquet of Chestnuts. A feast where 50 courtesans crawled across marble floors for the entertainment of Rome's most powerful men, while the Pope, his son Cesare, and his daughter Lucrezia looked on. What began as a dinner turned into a contest of lust, a spectacle that would stain the papacy for centuries. But this story is not just about one night. It is about a family who rose from obscurity in Spain to rule Rome like monarchs, bending the Church of God into their personal empire. It is about ambition unchecked, power corrupted, and the fine line between the sacred and the profane. Tonight, we pull back the veil of secrecy and enter the dark heart of Renaissance Rome. The Vatican in the year 1501 was a place of contradiction. To pilgrims arriving from distant lands, it shimmered as the center of Christian devotion, the beating heart of Catholicism. Marble facades glowed under the Roman sun, and the basilicas stood like monuments to divine glory. Yet behind those grand facades, inside chambers that only a privileged few could enter, another story unfolded, a story far less holy, and far more human. The man at the center of this paradox was Rodrigo Borgia, better known to history as Pope Alexander VI. His rise from the dusty roads of Spain to the throne of St. Peter was not the tale of a devout shepherd chosen by God, but of a shrewd opportunist who mastered the darker arts of Renaissance politics. By the turn of the 16th century, his name had already become a byword for ambition, corruption, and unrestrained appetite. But to understand the notorious Banquet of Chestnuts, an event that would stain his legacy forever, we must first step back into the world that shaped him. Rodrigo was born on New Year's Day, 1431, in the small town of Zataiva, near Valencia. His family was respectable but not destined for greatness. It was his uncle, Alfonso de Borja, who first blazed the trail. Alfonso rose through the church hierarchy with calculated discipline, eventually becoming Pope Calixtus III in 1455. When he donned the papal tiara, Rodrigo's future was sealed. Nepotism was not a dirty word in Renaissance Rome, it was the lifeblood of advancement. And so, at the age of 25, Rodrigo was elevated to cardinal deacon. He arrived in Rome with a hunger that could not be quenched by sermons or scripture. Rome in the late 15th century was itself a paradox, a city where pilgrims knelt before altars by day and merchants of flesh counted their coins by night. In such a place, Rodrigo thrived. He collected benefices and church offices across Europe, amassing wealth with the patience of a spider weaving its web. If Rodrigo was meant to embody clerical purity, he failed spectacularly. His palaces were filled with silk tapestries, feasts, and music. He fathered children openly with Venazia Catanii, a Roman noblewoman, and scandal followed him wherever he went. Even Pope Pius II, a man hardly known for strict moralism, felt compelled to chastise him in a letter, condemning his behavior in Siena that had shocked the entire court. But Rodrigo was not ashamed. Shame, after all, could be a trap. He had his eyes fixed on a greater prize, the papacy itself. To reach it, he would need to outmaneuver rivals, bribe allies, and charm those who could not be bought. The papal conclave of August 1492 unfolded like a theater of corruption. 23 cardinals locked themselves inside the Sistine Chapel. Gold flowed more freely than holy water. Promises were whispered like prayers, and bishoprics were traded like commodities in a marketplace. When the smoke cleared, Rodrigo Borgia emerged victorious, taking the name Alexander VI. Rome erupted in celebration. The Spanish cardinal had long been familiar to them, and they expected his pontificate to bring order and magnificence. Torchlit processions wound through the streets, and triumphal arches rose in his honor. On August 26, his coronation at St. Peter's Basilica was greeted with cheers described as the greatest ovation any pope had ever received. At first, Alexander seemed determined to justify the faith placed in him. He re-established order in Rome, where assassinations had become a near-daily occurrence. He appointed magistrates to keep the peace, and each week he personally heard grievances, dispensing justice with surprising efficiency. For a brief moment, it seemed as though divine providence might have chosen wisely. But power is a wine that reveals character more than it creates it. And for Alexander, that revelation was devastating. If Alexander cared for the church, it was only insofar as the church could serve his family. His children were his true legacy. Juan, his eldest son, became Duke of Gandia in Spain and married into the Spanish royal family. Cesare, brilliant and ruthless, was given the Archbishopric of Valencia at just 18, later elevated to cardinal. Lucrezia, his daughter, was used as a pawn in a series of political marriages, her personal happiness sacrificed to strengthen Borgia alliances. To many observers, the papal apartments no longer resembled the dwelling of a spiritual shepherd. They were a royal court, complete with mistresses, feasts, and endless intrigues. Giulia Farnese, known across Rome as Giulia la Bella for her breathtaking beauty, moved through the Vatican as freely as any bishop. She was Alexander's mistress, and her presence was a daily reminder that vows of celibacy were a fiction in this papacy. Into this world stepped Johann Burchard, a man with the instincts of an accountant and the eyes of a hawk. Born around 1450, trained in canon law, Burchard rose to become the papal master of ceremonies. His job was to organize the rituals and solemn functions of the Vatican. But his quill recorded far more than hymns and coronations. From 1483 onward, Burchard kept a diary, the Liber Notarum. In its pages, he documented not just the grandeur of papal ceremonies but also the scandals whispered in corridors and shouted in banquet halls. His tone was dry, almost clinical, but it was precisely this detachment that gave his words credibility. When he described a papal procession, every candle was counted. When he described a papal scandal, every detail was preserved with equal precision. It is thanks to Burchard that we know of the most infamous night in papal history, the night of the Banquet of Chestnuts. By the late 1490s, the Borgia name was already whispered with fear and disdain across Europe. Juan, once the golden heir, had been found floating in the Tiber, his body riddled with wounds. Alexander mourned bitterly but soon returned to his old ways, pushing reforms aside as quickly as he had announced them. Cesare, meanwhile, emerged as his father's sword, a commander whose charisma and cruelty drew both admiration and terror. Rome itself reflected their reign. Streets were paved with spectacle. The Jubilee year of 1500 brought hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, filling both the churches and the brothels. Money poured into papal coffers, much of it funneled into Cesare's wars. Within the Vatican walls, the lines between sacred and profane blurred until they vanished altogether. And then came October 31, 1501. All Hallows' Eve, a night when tradition said the veil between the living and the dead grew thin. In the private chambers of Cesare Borgia, the family prepared an entertainment unlike any before it. An entertainment that would sear itself into memory as the ultimate symbol of papal corruption. The guests had been summoned. Cardinals, nobles, foreign envoys, they all entered those chambers, perhaps curious, perhaps complicit. 50 courtesans waited, their silks rustling in anticipation. Candles blazed. Incense thickened the air. What happened next would be recorded in whispers, in letters, and in the unflinching Latin prose of Johann Burchard. It would be called, forever after, the Banquet of Chestnuts. The rise of Rodrigo Borgia to the throne of St. Peter was not simply a tale of one man's hunger for power, but a reflection of the age in which he lived. Renaissance Rome was a city where grandeur and corruption coexisted side by side, where the language of faith was spoken as easily as the language of money and influence. It was a time when the papacy was not merely a spiritual office but also one of the greatest prizes of political ambition in all of Europe. Rodrigo's election in 1492 was celebrated as though a new emperor had ascended. The streets filled with torches, arches were raised in his honor, and people cheered the prospect of stability after years of violence and uncertainty. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though Alexander VI might truly be the reformer Rome needed. He spoke of justice, of restoring order, of cleansing the city from the waves of crime that had turned its alleys into hunting grounds. And indeed, for a short while, he acted on these promises. Magistrates were appointed, patrols kept the peace, and the Pope himself heard grievances from citizens once a week, delivering judgments with surprising efficiency. Rome exhaled with relief. Perhaps this Spaniard, with his commanding presence and keen mind, could truly bring balance. But within the Vatican walls, something else was unfolding. Alexander's devotion was not to the universal church but to the blood of his own family. His eldest son Juan was showered with titles, including the Duchy of Gandia, and married into the Spanish royal line. Cesare, his second son, was thrust into church offices while still a teenager, becoming Archbishop of Valencia and eventually a cardinal. Lucrezia, his beloved daughter, was treated as a bargaining chip, married and remarried to secure alliances that would benefit the Borgia name. The papal palace became a stage for dynastic theater, each move calculated not for Christendom, but for the Borgia's empire. In Rome, the whispers never ceased. Julia Farnese, Alexander's mistress, moved through the Vatican like a queen, her beauty captivating, her presence scandalous. The vows of celibacy seemed like a cruel joke when even the Pope lived as openly as any prince. Diplomats wrote letters home describing feasts that lasted until dawn, music echoing through the halls, entertainers and courtesans mingling with the highest officials of the church. The boundaries between sacred duty and worldly indulgence blurred until they were almost indistinguishable. Still, Alexander was not without his admirers. To some, he represented energy, charisma, and an ability to get things done. He was not the first pope to have children, nor the first to use money and politics to secure power. But what set him apart was the scale, the sheer audacity with which he pursued his goals. Every appointment of a bishopric, every indulgence sold, every marriage arranged for his children, all of it fed into the grand vision of a Borgia dynasty. The cost of this ambition soon became apparent. In 1497, tragedy struck. One Borgia, the Pope's favorite son, was found floating in the Tiber River, his throat cut and his body bearing multiple wounds. Rome buzzed with speculation. Who had killed the Duke of Gandia? Was it a rival family? A jealous lover? Or, as some dared to whisper, his own brother Cesare, whose ambition could not bear competition even within the family? The murder shook Alexander to his core. For days he refused food, shut himself away in grief, and even announced sweeping reforms to the church. He spoke of ending simony, of curbing luxury, of returning the clergy to moral discipline. For a brief moment, it seemed as though grief might succeed where conscience had failed. But Alexander's sorrow, like so much else in his life, was fleeting. Soon the tears dried, the reforms were shelved, and his gaze turned back to Cesare, the son who had survived, the one who embodied the ruthlessness the family needed. Cesare resigned his cardinal's hat, becoming the first man in history to voluntarily abandon the sacred office, and turned instead to the life of a soldier and statesman. Tall, handsome, and brilliant, Cesare commanded both fear and admiration. His campaigns across Italy carved out new territories, his assassinations eliminated rivals, and his cunning negotiations impressed even hardened diplomats. Niccolò Machiavelli, watching from Florence, later immortalized him in The Prince, holding him up as the model of what a ruler must be, decisive, merciless, and unburdened by morality. Yet wars cost money, and even papal coffers had their limits. To fund Cesare's campaigns, Alexander turned increasingly to the sale of indulgences and church offices. Wealthy families purchased cardinals' hats for their sons, not for piety but for prestige. Bishops' seats became commodities, bought and sold as though salvation itself could be traded. Over his reign, Alexander appointed 47 new cardinals, each appointment a source of gold, each transaction another brick in the Borgia edifice of power. This corruption did not go unnoticed. Across Europe, whispers grew louder. Reformers in Florence, priests in Germany, nobles in France, they all pointed to Rome and said, "Here is proof of a church rotten to its core." Alexander, however, remained unmoved. He dined with cardinals who shared his excesses, entertained courtesans in his chambers, and elevated his children as though the Vatican itself were a family inheritance. For those inside Rome, resistance was dangerous. To decline an invitation to one of the Pope's entertainments was to risk being marked as an enemy. And enemies of the Borgias often met grim ends. By the Jubilee year of 1500, the contradictions of Rome had reached their peak. Pilgrims poured into the city, hundreds of thousands strong, seeking absolution, climbing the steps of sacred basilicas, leaving alms at holy shrines. At the same time, the city's brothels overflowed, merchants counted fortunes, and papal coffers swelled with indulgence money. Rome was a city of devotion by day and decadence by night, and at its heart stood a pope who seemed to embody both. Within this atmosphere, Cesare's power grew unstoppable. He conquered Romagna, subdued rebellious lords, and built a reputation as one of the most feared commanders in Europe. The family stood at the very height of their influence. Yet as with all heights, there was a precipice waiting just beyond. For in October of 1501, Alexander and Cesare would preside over a spectacle so brazen, so scandalous, that even in an age accustomed to corruption, it would leave an indelible scar on papal history. It began, as such things often did, with a banquet. The guests were summoned, cardinals in their crimson robes, Roman nobles draped in velvet, foreign envoys curious to witness the inner life of the papacy. The setting was Cesare's apartments, magnificently decorated with frescoes of saints and heroes, their painted eyes gazing down as silent witnesses. The air was thick with incense and candle smoke. 50 courtesans were assembled, dressed in silks chosen to flatter their beauty. Music swelled, goblets of wine overflowed, and the atmosphere shifted from polite conversation to something darker, more primal. The night was All Hallows' Eve, when old superstition claimed the barrier between the living and the dead grew thin. Whether chosen by design or coincidence, the symbolism was perfect. For that night, beneath the frescoes of saints, beneath the roof of Christ's vicar, the sacred and the profane would collapse into one another. The evening of October 31, 1501 began like countless other gatherings within the Vatican during the reign of Alexander VI. Servants hurried through corridors carrying silver platters stacked high with roasted meats, candied fruits, and flagons of aged wine. Musicians tuned their lutes and viols in a corner, ready to fill the chambers with song. Courtiers, cardinals, and nobles arrived in silken robes, exchanging polite words as they adjusted rings and straightened embroidered sleeves. On the surface, it looked like another night of Renaissance splendor, one of many feasts the Pope and his children were known to host. But there was an undercurrent to this particular night, a restlessness in the air that made the candles flicker a little more violently and the perfume of incense seem thicker, almost suffocating. This was not just another banquet. The date itself carried weight, All Hallows' Eve, when the old superstitions whispered that the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. It was the perfect night for a spectacle that would blur the line between sacred devotion and profane indulgence. At the center of it all stood Cesare Borgia. Draped in a doublet of black and crimson, he moved among the guests with the confidence of a man who knew he controlled the room. His charm was magnetic, his words sharp, and his gaze seemed to command obedience. Some guests admired him openly, others feared him quietly, but none could ignore him. Beside him, Pope Alexander VI reclined like a monarch rather than a spiritual leader, his golden robes gleaming in the candlelight. At his side, shockingly present, was his daughter Lucrezia, a figure both mysterious and tragic in the eyes of contemporaries. Whether she attended of her own will or out of obligation remains uncertain, but her presence would haunt the memory of this night for centuries to come. The banquet began with abundance. Platters of roasted chestnuts, seasonal delicacies in Rome, were passed around, their aroma mingling with the scent of honeyed cakes and roasted fowl. Silver goblets clinked as wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and stirring laughter. Diplomats from France and Spain leaned in close to cardinals, trading gossip and subtle political barbs. Nobles from ancient Roman families watched with wary fascination, measuring the Borgia's power against their own fading influence. As the meal progressed, the musicians struck livelier tunes. A troop of courtesans entered, 50 in total, their gowns of silk and velvet shimmering as they moved. These were no ordinary women from the streets of Rome, but courtesans renowned for their refinement as much as their beauty. They smiled knowingly as they glided across the floor, accustomed to the delicate balance of performance and discretion demanded in such gatherings. To the uninitiated, their entrance might have seemed nothing more than entertainment after a heavy feast. But to those who knew the reputation of Cesare's court, the true purpose of the evening was becoming clear. The courtesans began to dance, at first in formation, their movements graceful and suggestive, accompanied by the plucked strings of lutes. The guests clapped to the rhythm, their faces flushed from wine. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nature of the performance shifted. The gowns that had covered the dancers began to loosen. A shoulder revealed here, a glimpse of leg there. Fabric slipped away like petals falling from a flower. The transition was gradual enough that no one could claim surprise, yet deliberate enough that no one could mistake what was happening. The atmosphere in the room changed with it. The laughter grew louder, the applause more raucous. Guests leaned forward in their seats, their jeweled hands gripping the edges of tables as if unwilling to miss a moment. The Pope himself looked on without flinching, his face set in an expression that mingled satisfaction with indulgence. The message was clear, this was his court, and in his court, no boundary between sacred and profane remained unbroken. When the dancers had shed their gowns entirely, the true spectacle began. Servants moved swiftly, clearing the tables of silverware and food. The tall golden candlesticks were lifted from the tables and placed directly on the floor, their flames casting pools of light amid deep pockets of shadow. Then baskets of chestnuts, those humble fruits so common in Roman markets, were scattered across the marble floor between the candles. The women, now entirely nude, were instructed to crawl on hands and knees, collecting the chestnuts while the audience watched. The sight was surreal. 50 women, their bodies gleaming with sweat and candlelight, crawled between patches of light and shadow, their movements slow and deliberate. The chestnuts clattered softly across the marble, rolling into corners, scattering beneath arches. Each movement of the women seemed amplified by the silence of the audience, broken only by the occasional burst of laughter or the faint notes of music continuing in the background. Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, sat quietly at the edge of the room. Bound by duty to attend, he observed everything with the detached precision of a clerk recording an account book. His quill would later preserve every detail in Latin, describing the crawling women, the scattered chestnuts, the candlelit chamber, and the Pope himself seated in a position of honor, flanked by his son and daughter. For Burchard, this was not entertainment. It was evidence of a papacy that had descended into spectacle. As the chestnuts were gathered, the tone of the evening darkened further. Competitions were announced, and the male guests, cardinals, nobles, and diplomats alike, were encouraged to prove their virility by engaging with the courtesans. Prizes of silk tunics, fine shoes, and jeweled caps were promised to those who achieved the most. Servants were ordered to keep count, transforming what should have been private intimacy into a public tally. It was no longer merely a banquet, it had become a contest of lust, sanctioned by the Pope himself. To some, the evening may have felt exhilarating, a liberation from the suffocating expectations of piety. To others, it was horrifying, a desecration of the very heart of Christendom. But none present could deny the significance of what they had witnessed. In the very palace where saints' relics were kept, where pilgrims believed the Vicar of Christ interceded for their salvation, the walls now echoed with laughter, moans, and the scraping of chestnuts across marble floors. When the night finally ended, the chamber smelled of smoke, sweat, and spilled wine. Candles guttered low, casting long shadows across frescoed walls where painted saints seemed to avert their eyes. The courtesans slipped away into the darkness, the guests returned to their palaces, and the Borgias remained, sated, unashamed, and unrepentant. By morning, the Vatican would appear as it always had, grand, holy, and unchanged. But beneath the surface, something had shifted forever. The Banquet of Chestnuts was more than a night of decadence. It was a symbol, a moment when the spiritual authority of the papacy collapsed into spectacle. And though the participants would move on, though pilgrims would still flock to St. Peter's Basilica, the whispers of what had happened that night would travel across Europe, carried in letters, in gossip, and in the meticulous notes of Johann Burchard. The scandal had only just begun. By dawn, the great chamber of Cesare Borgia's Vatican apartments lay silent. The candles had burned down to wax stubs, the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of smoke, sweat, and spilled wine. Servants worked quickly to clear away the debris of the night, empty goblets, overturned platters, scattered chestnuts that had clattered across the marble floors. By morning, the halls would be pristine again, and visitors would see only grandeur. But the memory of what had happened there could not be swept away so easily. Within hours, whispers began to circulate. The Vatican was a palace, but it was also a hive of servants, guards, and minor officials who carried eyes and ears into every corner. A guard on duty outside the chamber, a servant dismissed too late, a musician paid to play discreetly, all became messengers of rumor. What they saw or heard was retold in hushed tones across Rome. The details shifted in the telling, some accounts more lurid than others, but the essence remained unchanged. The Pope and his children had presided over a night of unholy spectacle, a contest of lust held within the very heart of Christendom. Rome was a city accustomed to scandal, but this one struck deeper. Pilgrims arriving to kneel at the shrines of saints heard mutterings of what had transpired only steps away from the relics they venerated. Merchants repeated the story in marketplaces, adding embellishments with each retelling. Noble families hostile to the Borgias seized on the gossip, eager to spread tales that confirmed what they had long believed, that Alexander VI was no vicar of Christ but a monarch of vice. Diplomatic channels carried the story even farther. Ambassadors who had attended the feast, or who had received reports from their envoys, sent letters home to their kings and courts. In France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, ministers read with shock and fascination. Even those accustomed to the excesses of secular courts found the image of the Pope's chamber turned into a brothel almost beyond belief. Some could not decide whether to treat the story as a curiosity or as a political weapon. But the letters survive in archives across Europe, proof that the scandal traveled far beyond the Vatican's marble walls. The reaction was not uniform. Some laughed at the hypocrisy, shrugging their shoulders at behavior they considered unsurprising. Others trembled at the implications. If the Pope himself could preside over such degradation, what did that say about the authority of the Church? Could the sacraments still be trusted? Could indulgences still carry weight, when their sale had financed spectacles of this kind? The questions spread like cracks in a fresco, invisible at first but widening with each new telling. Inside the Vatican, Alexander VI showed no sign of remorse. He appeared at public audiences as though nothing had occurred, blessing pilgrims, presiding over Mass, receiving ambassadors. His calmness was calculated. To acknowledge the scandal would give it power. To ignore it was to dare others to challenge him openly, something few in Rome had the courage to do. And yet, even his silence was a form of confession, for it showed he considered himself beyond reproach. Cesare, for his part, carried on with his campaigns in central Italy. He had carved out a dominion through a mix of sieges, assassinations, and political marriages, and the resources of the Papal States continued to flow into his war chest. The scandal of the banquet did nothing to slow his ambition. If anything, it added to the aura of fear surrounding him. Those who opposed Cesare knew he was backed not only by armies but by a family unafraid of scandal, of judgment, even of God's wrath. But outside Italy, the banquet's reverberations were more profound. In Florence, reformers such as Girolamo Savonarola had already thundered against the corruption of Rome before his execution in 1498. Now his word seemed vindicated. In the German states, preachers began to cite stories of papal debauchery as evidence of rot within the Church. The seeds of reform, long dormant, found new nourishment in these tales. Less than 2 decades later, Martin Luther would publish his theses in Wittenberg, but the ground for his protest was prepared by scandals such as this. In theological circles, the Banquet of Chestnuts became a symbol. Theologians debated not the salacious details but the deeper meaning. How far could a pope fall before his authority ceased to be valid? Could the personal sins of the pontiff invalidate the sacraments he administered? For centuries, Catholic teaching had drawn a distinction between the holiness of the office and the worthiness of the man who held it. Now that distinction was stretched to its breaking point. The tension could be felt in the streets. On one hand, the people of Rome continued their rituals. They attended Mass, gave alms, and lined up for indulgences. Faith in the Church's spiritual machinery remained strong. But on the other hand, cynicism spread. When a cardinal preached against sin, people smirked. When indulgences were sold, some whispered that the coins would be spent not on the poor or the crusades, but on more feasts, more women, more chestnuts scattered on marble floors. Burchard's account of the banquet, written in the cool detachment of Latin prose, was copied and preserved in the Vatican's secret archives. For centuries, it would remain hidden, sealed away from public eyes. But even then, enough copies and references circulated to ensure the story lived on. It was not merely an anecdote of vice, it became evidence, a weapon in the hands of critics who sought to expose the papacy's moral bankruptcy. The banquet also exposed the vulnerability of Alexander himself. For all his bravado, he must have known the whispers weakened his standing. The moral authority of the papacy had always been its greatest weapon. Kings could be excommunicated, entire nations placed under interdict. But what force did such threats carry when the Pope's own household indulged in spectacles that would have shamed pagan emperors? By the early 1500s, the Vatican was no longer merely the seat of Christendom. It had become, in the eyes of many, a stage where the sacred and profane danced together, locked in a grotesque embrace. And though Alexander VI and his children may have thought they had triumphed, they had in fact sown the seeds of their downfall. For power built on scandal and fear can endure for a time, but it leaves behind scars that history will never forget. The Banquet of Chestnuts was not an isolated moment of weakness. It was the culmination of years of corruption, the logical outcome of a family that treated the papacy as a dynasty to be expanded rather than a sacred trust to be guarded. And while the morning after Rome looked unchanged, the basilicas still filled, the pilgrims still praying, the spiritual foundation of the Church had been shaken. From Florence to Paris, from Wittenberg to London, the whispers spread, turning into questions, and questions into challenges. The Borgias had won their night of indulgence. But in doing so, they had handed their enemies a weapon more powerful than swords or armies, the truth of their own corruption. In the months that followed the infamous banquet, Rome appeared outwardly unchanged. Pilgrims still arrived in endless processions, kneeling at the shrines of saints, leaving coins at altars, whispering prayers for salvation. The basilicas still rang with hymns, the incense still rose toward painted ceilings. To the casual observer, the Vatican was as eternal and unshaken as it had ever been. But beneath the marble and the gold, cracks were spreading. The banquet had not destroyed Alexander VI in the moment, it had emboldened him. Freed from the pretense of restraint, he plunged even deeper into the entanglement of politics, family ambition, and the pursuit of power. The Borgia family, far from chastened, stood taller than ever. Cesare Borgia had by now become a force that terrified Italy. He abandoned the vestments of a cardinal and donned the armor of a prince, leading armies across the peninsula with ruthless precision. Cities fell before him, Imola, Forli, Rimini, Faenza, Cesena, and more. Lords who resisted were imprisoned, assassinated, or simply vanished into dungeons. Those who surrendered were rewarded, at least until they ceased to be useful. Cesare's reputation spread quickly, handsome, intelligent, charismatic, but utterly merciless. For many, he was the embodiment of the new Renaissance prince, a man unshackled by morality, concerned only with results. Niccolò Machiavelli, serving as envoy from Florence, watched Cesare closely during these campaigns. In his letters, he described him as a man both admirable and terrifying. Later, in his famous work The Prince, he would hold Cesare up as the model of political power, able to combine cruelty with efficiency, to inspire both fear and loyalty. To Machiavelli, Cesare was not just a commander, he was a blueprint for rulership in a world where traditional morality no longer dictated survival. Behind Cesare's conquests stood the inexhaustible resources of his father. Alexander VI turned the papal office into a treasury for family ambition. The sale of indulgences became systematic, not occasional. Forgiveness could be bought with coin, salvation reduced to a transaction. Bishop seats, abbeys, even cardinalships were placed on the auction block, their prices measured in thousands of ducats. In his 11 years as pope, Alexander created 47 new cardinals, most of them chosen not for virtue but for wealth and loyalty. Each appointment brought new streams of gold, much of it diverted into Cesare's war chest. Rome during these years resembled less a holy city than a court under occupation by its own rulers. The Borgias lived as monarchs, treating the papal states as their personal kingdom. Banquets continued, not always as scandalous as the Banquet of Chestnuts, but always extravagant, filled with music, theater, and courtesans. Cardinals and ambassadors attended, knowing that to refuse was to mark oneself as an enemy. Alliances were tested in candlelit rooms, loyalty measured not by faith but by participation. Lucrezia Borgia, meanwhile, became a figure of both fascination and pity. Married off in quick succession to secure alliances, she was treated less as a daughter than as a political token. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was annulled on grounds of impotence when the family no longer needed the Sforzas. She was then married to Alfonso of Aragon, but when that alliance soured, Alfonso was murdered, most believed on Cesare's orders. Lucrezia's later marriage to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara would eventually grant her a more stable life, but during these years she was trapped within the machinery of her family's ambition, her reputation tarnished by rumors that she had never chosen her own path. Despite the corruption, Alexander VI was not entirely without accomplishments. He strengthened the papal administration, curbed banditry in the countryside, and oversaw projects that beautified Rome. Yet even these achievements were tainted by the methods used to fund them. For every street cleaned, an indulgence was sold, for every church restored, a bishopric was bought. It was a trade-off that left Rome gleaming on the surface but spiritually bankrupt beneath. Foreign rulers observed the situation with a mix of awe and suspicion. France found in Alexander a useful ally, especially when King Louis XII sought papal approval to annul his marriage. Spain, proud of the Borgias' Valencian roots, maintained ties but grew uneasy at the family's unchecked ambition. The Italian city-states, long fractious, watched Cesare's rise with dread. Some allied with him out of fear, others plotted in secret to bring him down. The Pope's court had become the center of Europe's most dangerous game, a game where crowns, lands, and lives could be won or lost overnight. Yet with each success, the Borgias drew closer to overreach. Power gained through fear is power balanced on a knife's edge. Enemies multiplied. Families like the Orsini and Colonna waited for the moment to strike back. Cardinals, smiling at feasts, whispered in shadows about betrayal. Even within the Vatican, resentment grew. For while Alexander rewarded his allies richly, he demanded absolute loyalty, and those who faltered discovered how swiftly favor could turn to ruin. In 1500, the Jubilee year brought an unprecedented flood of pilgrims into Rome. Hundreds of thousands journeyed to the city, filling its streets with devotion. The papal treasury swelled as indulgences were sold on a scale never before seen. But the juxtaposition was stark, pilgrims kneeling in prayer by day, courtesans and nobles reveling by night. Rome became a mirror of contradiction, a city where the holy and the profane lived side by side, separated by nothing more than a door or a curtain. It was during this very height of their influence that the Banquet of Chestnuts began to resurface in foreign correspondence. Letters carried to Paris, Madrid, and Vienna spoke not only of Cesare's victories but of the Pope's scandals. The two were inseparable. Power, yes, but at what cost? Even those who admired Cesare's brilliance admitted unease at the foundation of his strength. For in every whispered account of debauchery, in every tale of corruption, the Borgias were arming their critics with the very weapons that would one day bring them down. Still, Alexander VI did not change course. If anything, the scandal liberated him from restraint. No longer needing to maintain even the appearance of sanctity, he ruled openly as a secular prince. His court rivaled that of France or Milan in magnificence, his entertainments rivaled them in excess, and his ambition for his children surpassed them all. But in doing so, he made enemies not only among rival families but among reformers across Europe. For men like Savonarola in Florence, already executed but remembered, this was the proof of prophecy. For others, it was the final straw, evidence that the church itself needed cleansing. The Borgias had reached their zenith. Cesare's armies marched with triumph, Alexander's coffers overflowed, and the papal palace glittered with splendor. Yet beneath it all lay the undeniable truth: such heights could not last. The very extravagance that proclaimed their greatness was also the herald of their fall. History had seen this pattern before, in emperors, in kings, in dynasties too powerful for their own survival. And so, even as Rome bowed before the Borgias, the seeds of collapse were already sown. For power built on gold and fear, spectacle and scandal, can dazzle for a moment. But sooner or later, it demands a reckoning. Power, once secured, rarely rests quietly. For the Borgias, the years after their triumphs carried with them a sense of inevitability, an undercurrent that whispered that fortune was about to turn. Rome still glittered with splendor, Cesare still rode at the head of armies, and Alexander VI still presided from his gilded throne. Yet in every corridor of the Vatican, in every letter dispatched from Rome, one could sense the gathering of shadows. The first sign had come years earlier, with the death of Juan Borgia, Alexander's eldest son. His body, thrown into the Tiber with multiple stab wounds, had been a wound the Pope never truly recovered from. Alexander had mourned bitterly, locking himself away and speaking of reform, only to abandon those promises once grief subsided. But the memory of Juan's corpse floating on the river remained a symbol of the family's fragility. For all their power, the Borgias could not protect even their own blood. Rome whispered that Cesare himself had arranged the killing, unwilling to share influence with a brother. Whether true or not, the suspicion revealed how deeply fear and betrayal had already infected the family's empire. By 1502, Cesare was at the height of his power. His campaigns had subdued the Romagna, his enemies lay dead or defeated, and his name was spoken with dread from Florence to Venice. But with each victory, enemies multiplied. The Orsini and Colonna families, long humbled, plotted in secret. Cities that had bent the knee waited for the moment to break free. Even those who had once admired Cesare began to question how far his cruelty would extend. Machiavelli, though fascinated, admitted in private correspondence that Cesare's reliance on fortune, and on his father's papacy, made his position precarious. For Alexander VI, the strain of maintaining this empire grew heavier with each passing year. Age pressed down on him, though he disguised it beneath golden robes and public audiences. His health faltered, yet he clung to indulgence as fiercely as ever. Banquets continued, wealth poured in, and cardinals were created as though the college were an inexhaustible marketplace. But whispers in Rome turned darker. Many wondered what would happen to Cesare should his father die. The answer, unspoken yet clear, was that without the Pope's protection, the edifice of power might crumble overnight. That day came sooner than anyone expected. In August of 1503, Alexander VI fell ill. The official story spoke of malaria, a common enough fate in Rome's sweltering summer. Yet rumors swirled that he had been poisoned, perhaps by enemies, perhaps even by accident through poison meant for another. Whatever the cause, the mighty pope who had presided over scandal and triumph alike now lay in his bed, racked with fever. Cesare too fell ill at the same time, fueling suspicion that both had been targeted. The Vatican buzzed with panic. Servants whispered in corridors, ambassadors dispatched urgent letters, and the cardinals waited in grim silence for what seemed inevitable. On August 18, 1503, Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, died. He who had crowned himself with indulgence and scandal, who had raised his children above the Church, who had turned the Vatican into a stage for ambition, was gone. Accounts describe his body swelling and blackening quickly, a grotesque spectacle that seemed to mirror his reputation. Rome, accustomed to spectacle, could hardly ignore the symbolism. To his enemies, it was divine justice. To his allies, it was the end of an era. The consequences were immediate. Cesare, weakened by illness and suddenly bereft of his father's authority, saw his empire unravel. The cardinals moved swiftly to distance themselves from the Borgias, eager to cleanse the papacy of its most notorious family. Enemies struck with vengeance long held in check. Cities Cesare had conquered rose in rebellion, banners of loyalty torn down overnight. The French, once his allies, wavered. The Spanish, his blood kin, considered him too dangerous to support. He who had seemed invincible became vulnerable in a matter of days. Cesare tried desperately to hold his ground. He negotiated, threatened, and plotted, but his strength was broken. Within a few years, he was forced into exile, stripped of his titles, reduced from feared prince to wandering mercenary. In 1507, at the age of 31, he died in Spain, cut down in a skirmish far from the palaces he once ruled. His dream of carving a kingdom out of Italy perished with him, leaving behind only his legend, the dark prince Machiavelli would immortalize, admired for his brilliance, condemned for his cruelty. Lucrezia, left behind in Rome, fared better but carried the stain of her family's name. Married into the Este family of Ferrara, she reinvented herself as a patroness of the arts, a respected duchess. Yet the whispers of her youth never left her. To some, she was a pawn, an innocent caught in her father's schemes. To others, she was complicit, her presence at the Banquet of Chestnuts a silent testimony. History has treated her with more sympathy than her father or brother, but the shadow of the Borgias followed her to the grave. The papacy, eager to erase the memory of Alexander VI, moved quickly under his successor, Julius II. The new pope refused to occupy the Borgia apartments where the Banquet of Chestnuts had taken place. He relocated to chambers above and commissioned Raphael to paint frescoes that would redefine the Vatican's image. Where once scandal had reigned, now beauty and majesty sought to cover the stain. Yet no art could erase the whispers that lingered. For though Alexander VI had died, his reign left scars that shaped the course of Christendom. Reformers seized on his example as proof of Rome's corruption. Preachers in Germany cited his scandals when calling for change. When Martin Luther nailed his theses in Wittenberg 14 years later, he did so against a backdrop shaped in part by the memory of Alexander's excess. The Council of Trent, decades later, would impose discipline on priests and restore dignity to the papacy, but always in the shadow of scandals that could never be forgotten. The fall of the Borgias revealed a truth as old as power itself: ambition can build empires, but it cannot outlast time. Gold can buy silence, but not forever. Fear can control cities, but not eternity. In the end, the Banquet of Chestnuts had not merely been an evening of indulgence, it had been a symbol of what happens when spiritual authority becomes indistinguishable from worldly desire. As the candles guttered out in August of 1503, with Alexander lying dead and Cesare fevered beside him, the Borgias' dream of dynasty ended. The Vatican remained, the Church endured, but the memory of their rule lingered like smoke in a closed chamber, thick, choking, impossible to ignore. And in that memory, history would forever remember the most corrupt pope of all, not only for how he lived, but for how utterly his house collapsed when death finally came to claim him. When the bells of Rome tolled on August 18, 1503, announcing the death of Pope Alexander VI, the city exhaled as though waking from a fever dream. The Borgia's grip on the Vatican had been broken. Cesare, weakened by illness and stripped of the papal authority that shielded him, scrambled to preserve the empire he had built, only to watch it dissolve piece by piece. Lucrezia, now in Ferrara, attempted to distance herself from the shadow of her father and brother, but her name was forever entangled with theirs. The papacy itself, tarnished by scandal after scandal, now faced the monumental task of repairing its credibility. The immediate aftermath was telling. Julius II, Alexander's successor, refused to live in the Borgia apartments. The chambers that had once echoed with laughter, music, and whispered debauchery were abandoned. Instead, Julius moved into rooms above and commissioned Raphael to decorate them with frescoes of unmatched beauty. His decision was both practical and symbolic, to cover the stains of the past with art that would endure as a testament to renewal. Yet no matter how glorious Raphael's brushstrokes, the whispers of what had taken place below could not be erased. In the decades that followed, the memory of Alexander VI's reign, and above all the Banquet of Chestnuts, became ammunition for those who sought to challenge the Church. Protestant reformers seized upon the story as proof that the papacy had strayed irredeemably from its spiritual mission. Martin Luther, when he nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, did so in a world already convinced that Rome was corrupt. Pamphlets circulated painting lurid images of papal vice, and though some exaggerations bordered on the fantastical, they needed little invention. The truth was damning enough. Catholic historians in later centuries tried to mitigate the scandal, suggesting Burchard's account may have been embellished, or that hostile voices had exaggerated details to smear Alexander's legacy. Yet the consistency of the sources, from diplomatic letters to eyewitness accounts, made outright denial impossible. Even if every detail were not exact, the essence of the story rang true, a papacy so consumed by worldly power that it had ceased to distinguish between the sacred and the profane. The Council of Trent, convened in 1545, carried the shadow of Alexander's reign into its deliberations. Determined to restore dignity to the Church, the council imposed strict discipline on clergy, reformed the system of indulgences, and established seminaries for proper training of priests. These measures were not abstract theological adjustments, they were direct responses to the kind of abuses that had festered under the Borgias. The grandeur of Baroque ceremony that followed in later centuries was in part an effort to rebuild the majesty of the papacy without reopening the door to scandal. Yet even as reform cleansed the outward face of the Church, Alexander VI's reign remained a cautionary tale. Historians could not forget the image of courtesans crawling for chestnuts in candlelit halls while the Pope and his children looked on. The symbolism was too powerful, the lowest appetites displayed in the highest sanctuary of Christendom. It became a story retold not only as history but as parable, a reminder of how power corrupts when unchecked by principle. For the people of Rome, the banquet had also left its mark. Many ordinary believers learned to separate faith in God from faith in priests. They continued to attend Mass, to pray at shrines, to seek the sacraments, but with eyes open to the failings of those who claimed to mediate the divine. This quiet resilience of popular piety perhaps explains why the Church survived the scandals of the Renaissance at all. The institution may have been stained, but the faith of the people endured. Over the centuries, the Borgias came to embody both fascination and horror. Cesare became immortalized in Machiavelli's writings as the ruthless but brilliant prince. Lucrezia was recast by later generations as either a victim or a seductress, depending on the storyteller's taste. And Alexander VI. He was remembered above all as the most corrupt pope in history, a man who placed his family above his flock, who turned indulgences into currency, and who presided over a spectacle that would haunt the Vatican for centuries. But perhaps the true significance of the Banquet of Chestnuts lies not in its lurid details, but in what it reveals about human nature. It is tempting to dismiss it as a grotesque anomaly, the excess of a single family in a single moment. Yet history shows that when power is concentrated, when accountability vanishes, the same patterns repeat. Whether in palaces, parliaments, or corporations, the temptation to confuse authority with license, and duty with desire, remains perennial. The chestnuts scattered on the marble floors of the Vatican in 1501 were more than props in an obscene game. They became symbols, small, ordinary things transformed into witnesses of extraordinary degradation. Just as they were gathered up before dawn, so too the memory of that night was swept beneath layers of art, ritual, and rhetoric. But memory has a way of enduring, even when hidden. It survives in whispers, in archives, in the lessons that echo across centuries. Today, tourists walk through Raphael's frescoed rooms, gazing in awe at colors that have defied time. Few realize that beneath their feet lies the site of one of history's most notorious scandals. The candles are long extinguished, the courtesans turned to dust, the Pope himself buried in Roman soil. Yet the questions remain, as pressing now as they were then: what happens when spiritual leaders abandon their calling? What damage is done when the guardians of faith become prisoners of desire? And can institutions survive when those who embody them betray their purpose so completely? In the end, Alexander VI's legacy is not only one of failure. It is also a reminder of resilience. The Church did not collapse under his corruption, though many thought it would. It endured, reformed, and in time regained much of its moral authority. But it endured scarred, marked forever by the memory of a pope who had confused the keys of heaven with the treasures of earth. And so the Banquet of Chestnuts stands in history as more than a scandal. It is a mirror, reflecting not only the vices of a single man but the frailties of humanity itself. The same species that builds cathedrals and paints masterpieces also succumbs to temptation in candlelit chambers. The same hands that raise the host at Mass may also scatter chestnuts on marble floors. That paradox, uncomfortable as it is, reminds us that the struggle between the sacred and the profane is not confined to the 15th century. It continues, in every age, in every heart. As long as power tempts, the story of Alexander VI will endure, not only as a warning, but as a question: will we gather the chestnuts of indulgence, or will we rise above them? History waits for the answer.